Decoding balance sheet to understand financial strength of a business. So friends, what we have covered so far is the income statement from the perspective of financial reporting, and we have also understood the income statement or the profit and loss statement from the perspective of decision making, decision about risk management, decision about value creation, decision about performance evaluation. Now let us shift our focus and understand balance sheet. Let us understand the balance sheet. Now balance sheet, friends, unlike the P&L which is prepared for a period, that period can be of 12 months, that period can be less than 12 months, and sometimes in exceptional cases that period can also be more than 12 months. So P&L is always for a year or for a period. Balance sheet is as on a date. So balance sheet is as on a date. So the balance sheet can be as at 31st March, as at 31st December, as at 30th June, as at 30th September. So the balance sheet is always as on a date. And balance sheet tells you what? Balance sheet tells you the financial strength or weakness of that company on that date. So as we understood the P&L in two parts, let us also understand the balance sheet also in two parts. Before that, remember, balance sheet is always divided into two parts. So number one is known as equity and liabilities, and number two is known as assets. Now before we start looking at the balance sheet line by line, let us broadly understand what is the meaning of equity. Equity simply means shareholders' money into the business. That is equity. Shareholders' money into the business is equity. Then you have something which is known as non-current liabilities. So what are non-current liabilities? Very simple. Non-current liabilities are those liabilities of a business which are to be paid by the company beyond a period of 12 months. So that is your non-current liabilities. तो non-current liability का मतलब क्या है? Non-current liability का मतलब है कंपनी के या बिजनेस के वो ऑब्लिगेशंस जो कि कंपनी ने, बिजनेस ने 12 महीने के बाद में डिस्चार्ज करना है. दैट इज योर नॉन करंट लाइबिलिटीज. नॉन करंट लाइबिलिटीज को फ्रेंड्स लॉन्ग टर्म लाइबिलिटीज भी कहते हैं. उनको लॉन्ग टर्म लाइबिलिटीज भी कहते हैं. देन यू हैव अ करंट लाइबिलिटी. नाउ व्हाट इज करंट लाइबिलिटी? नाउ द डेफिनेशन ऑफ करंट लाइबिलिटी, फ्रेंड्स, ऑफ कोर्स इज वेरी सिंपल. अ लाइबिलिटी which is not a non-current liability is a current liability. A liability which is not a non-current liability is a current liability. Meaning what? Meaning current liabilities are those obligations of a business which the business has to discharge within a period of next 12 months, and that is your current liability. So that is in the first part of the balance sheet. In the second part of the balance sheet, you have the non-current assets and you have the current assets. What are the current assets? Very simple. Current assets are those assets of a business which are expected to get converted into cash within a period of 1 year. That is your current assets. Say for example, raw material is a current asset. And why it is a current asset? It is a current asset because business will purchase raw material not to hold it for infinity, but to take it to the shop floor, convert the raw material into WIP, convert the WIP into finished goods, and sell the finished goods and get cash against the sale of those finished goods. So that is the objective of purchasing the the inventory or the raw material, and that is why it is an example of current assets. What are the non-current assets? Non-current assets definition, of course, is again very simple, and please pay attention. Non-current assets are those assets of a business which are not current assets. It is really as simple as that. यानी कि नॉन करंट एसेट्स का मतलब क्या है? नॉन करंट एसेट्स का मतलब है वो एसेट्स ऑफ अ बिजनेस which are not current assets, that those are non-current assets. But remember, there's a very important difference between the current asset and the non-current assets. What the difference is, and that is what you must understand. That difference is current assets are expected to get converted into cash within a period of 1 year. Non-current assets are used for converting the current assets into cash. तो रॉ मटेरियल है, रॉ मटेरियल को कैश में कैसे कन्वर्ट करते हैं? रॉ मटेरियल को कैश में कन्वर्ट करते हैं by using the land, the building and the plant and machinery. So with the use of all these non-current assets, the raw material is converted into the finished product, it is sold in the market, and that is how you get the cash in your business. So that is your non-current assets. Let us now look at these balance sheet items one by one. So the number one is the equity share capital. Now what does it mean? It simply means हिंदुस्तान में नहीं बल्कि पूरी दुनिया में, whenever you start a company, every company which is started anywhere in the world, the promoters of the company will need to issue equity shares in that company, and that is your equity share capital. Equity share capital. Equity share capital also signifies the ownership. So who is the owner of the company, or who are the owners of the company? People who hold equity shares in a company, they are owners of that company. Second thing is preference share capital. Now please remember, it is not mandatory for a company to issue preference share capital, but sometimes company do issue preference share capital for strategic reasons. But remember, preference share capital holders are not the owners of the company. Owners of the company will always be the equity shareholders. Now what is the difference between the equity share capital and the preference share capital? There are many differences. The difference number one is the owner of the company is with the equity shareholders and not with the preference shareholders. Number two, in case if a company decides to pay dividend, the preference shareholders will have a preference in receiving the dividend before a dividend is paid to the equity shareholders. Difference number three, in case if company goes in for liquidation, first money will be paid to the preference shareholders, and if anything is left after paying to the preference shareholders, money will be returned to the equity shareholders. Difference number four, in case of preference share capital, the rate of dividend is always fixed. In case of equity shares, there is no fixed rate of dividend. Difference number five, if a company is making profit, company has to pay dividend to the preference shareholders. It is not mandatory for a company to pay dividend to the equity shareholders. Number six, the rate of dividend, okay, let me repeat it once again. The rate of dividend in case of preference share is fixed. In case of equity shares, the rate of dividend can be anything. There are examples when companies have paid dividend on equity shares at a rate of 5,000% also. Right. Number three is share premium. Now what is share premium? I am sure friends, some of you may be lucky to have purchased the shares of lucky or unlucky, I don't know, who must have bought the shares of a company called Paytm. Those of you who have bought the shares of Paytm will remember the issue price of the Paytm was 2,155. That means what? That means if you subscribed for the shares of Paytm, Paytm gave you one share for 2155 and Paytm gave you one share of a face value of rupee 1. That means you paid 2155 rupees to Paytm. 1 rupee was on account of the equity share face value. The difference 2054 that you paid to Paytm was on account of share premium. So this 255 that you paid to Paytm will reflect here as share premium. The fourth item as part of the equity and liability is equity particularly is reserves and surplus. Now remember, in this example you will see that the figure of reserves and surplus is 4,64,760 crore is the figure of reserves and surplus of this company. Now what does it mean? Does it mean that this company has got somewhere 4,64,762 crore of rupees lying with it somewhere? No, that is not the correct situation. The correct situation is this company has earned profit since its inception, and out of all the profit this company has earned since its inception, company has paid part of the dividend to the shareholders, right? Have paid the part of the profit as dividend to the shareholders, and 4,64,762 crore is the amount of the profit that the company has earned and plowed back into the business. Meaning what? Meaning ये जो figure है reserves and surplus का, what does it tell you? It only tells you that that so much of profit company has plowed back into the business. Good sign or bad sign? Obviously it is a good sign. Obviously it is a good sign. We will discuss it little later, but let me tell you at this point in time, one of the factor to differentiate between a weak balance sheet and a strong balance sheet is this figure of reserves and surplus. जिस कंपनी का रिजर्व्स एंड सरप्लस का फिगर जितना ज़्यादा होगा, मान के चलिए वो कंपनी उतनी ज़्यादा स्ट्रांग है, और जिस कंपनी का रिजर्व्स एंड सरप्लस का फिगर जितना लो होगा, वीक होगा, मान के चलिए वो कंपनी उतनी वीक है. सो दिस इज योर रिजर्व्स एंड सरप्लस. Now we come to the non-current liabilities. I am sure all of you will remember non-current liabilities का मतलब क्या है. Non-current liabilities का मतलब है liabilities of the business which are to be discharged by the company beyond a period of 12 months. So long term borrowing यानी कि कंपनियों वो जो लोन लिए हैं जो कि कंपनी को 12 महीने के बाद में चुकाने हैं, long term borrowings. Deferred tax liabilities is little technical term. We do not really have to worry about it. But you can understand deferred tax liability का मतलब ये है कि so much of tax company will have to pay in the times to come. So because of the past tax shield, company has managed not to pay so much of tax in the past even though it earned profit. But remember, it will have to be paid in future, and that is why it comes as deferred tax liability. Then you got a long term liabilities. Now what are the long term liabilities? Long term liabilities का मतलब है वो liabilities of a business which are to be paid by the company beyond a period of 12 months. So अब देखिए कंपनियां हैं, they make a provision for provident fund, they make provision for gratuity, they make provision for superannuation, they make provision for leave encashment. Now all these expenses which the companies are incurring, they are incurring in the current period, but they are not paying them now, they will be paying them in future. So all such expenses which are going to be discharged by the company beyond a period of 12 months are known as long-term liabilities. And likewise you have long-term provisions. So long-term liabilities and long-term provision, let us understand the difference between the liability and the provision. So the provision or liability, as a matter of fact, I would like to suggest that the provision, the amount of provident fund, the amount of gratuity, the amount of superannuation, the amount of cash, the amount of leave encashment that a company will pay in future will not be, really speaking, long-term liability. It will be long-term provision. So what is the difference between the provision and the liability? And please remember, the difference of course is very simple. Provision का मतलब है और liability का मतलब है the amount is frozen. You know for sure as to how much you have to pay. So let's say, for example, the company bought a plant and machinery from a German company for which it has to make a payment of 25 crore after 2 years. Now this 25 crore which is to be paid after 2 years, it is the long-term liability of the company. And why it is the long-term liability of the company? Because it has to be paid beyond the 12 months and plus the amount is known कि 25 करोड़ की प्लांट एंड मशीनरी खरीदी है तो 25 करोड़ का पेमेंट को करना है 2 साल के बाद में. सो दैट इज योर लॉन्ग टर्म लायबिलिटी. लॉन्ग टर्म प्रोविजन का मतलब क्या है? द अमाउंट इज नॉट नोन एग्जैक्टली. तो आप सुपर एनिमेशन का प्रोविजन करेंगे, ग्रेचुइटी का प्रोविजन करेंगे, प्रोविडेंट फंड का प्रोविजन करेंगे, लीव एनकैशमेंट का प्रोविजन करेंगे. तो ये जो भी आप प्रोविजन करेंगे वो एस्टिमेटेड फिगर होंगे. And that is why their liability is not frozen, though the company will have to make these liabilities in future, but the amounts are not frozen and therefore they will be appearing as part of the long-term provisions. And then under the current liabilities, so you will have short-term borrowing, and I'm sure short-term borrowing का क्या मतलब है? वो लोन जो कि कंपनी को 12 महीने के अंदर पे करने हैं. एंड ट्रेड पेबल का क्या मतलब है? कंपनी ने माल खरीदा उधारी में और वो उधारी चुकानी है. दैट इज योर ट्रेड पेबल. अदर करंट लाइबिलिटीज का मतलब है शॉर्ट टर्म बोरोइंग और ट्रेड पेबल के अलावा जो अदर करंट लाइबिलिटीज हो सकती हैं. क्या मतलब है इसका? एमएससीबी का बिल आ गया है लेकिन वो अगले महीने पे होगा, और आपके सैलरी का बिल, ये महीने का सैलरी का जो बिल है अगले महीने में पे होगा. एंड आपका हाउस कीपिंग का बिल है, बिल आ गया है लेकिन अगले महीने में पे होगा. सो दीज आर दी अदर करंट लाइबिलिटीज. दीज आर दी एक्सपेंसेस of the period which are due on the date of completing the balance sheet, and they will be paid in next 12 months. And short term provisions are, the difference between the short term provisions and the long term provisions is very simple. Provisions that you make for the expenses that will be paid by the company beyond a period of 12 months are long term provisions. The expenses that will need to be paid within next 12 months are your short term provisions. So this is your one side of the balance sheet. In case if there is any question, I would be happy to take them. Else we will move to the next part of the balance sheet, and that is the asset side of the balance sheet. So Vishesh, any question from anyone in the chat box?